Hello, and welcome back to Still Unbelievable. You have two hosts this week. I'm Andrew Knight, and with me is Doug Hoxworth. Hey, Doug, how you doing?
Hello, how are you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing great, and thank you for coming back to Still Unbelievable. We have an interesting show today. It's a little bit of a mind scrambler, right?
I would say yes, it is a mind scrambler.
So I think we're in conversation about the January 26, 2019 episode of Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. The episode was titled Logos, Mind, and Making Sense of the World. The episode debate was between Raymond Tallis and David Bentley Hart. That episode is really, in your view, Doug, I think about epistemology and ontology, right?
That's what I would say. One of the problems I came away with, and I think we discussed this, is it took us, the reason why this is coming so late is it took a while to figure out what the heck they were even talking about. And so I think our challenge will be to boil it down into a simple synthesis of what the subjects are without being without minimizing or without being reductionist and failing to actually do justice to the vastness of the subject. So I think, as I read through it and started to listen to it, I listened to it 4 times, I realized there are so many rabbit trails and the subject is so vast and the history is so long on this discussion that keeping it simple and synthesizing it such that somebody can understand what the issues are is going to be difficult. So, as we've prepared here just in discussing it, we're 2 hours into our discussion and now we're starting the podcast. So that's an example of how complicated it is.
Well, that's right. And it struck me just now that in the run-up, while we were talking about this before the mics came on, we didn't talk much about logos in regard to the broader topic, logos, mind, making sense of the world, because most of this episode was spent in discussion about the presocratics and Socrates and about rather esoteric views of philosophy that only eventually, toward the end of the show, wound their way to John chapter 1 and logos.
Yes.
But they did open the show in a pretty interesting spot. So they open the show with a quote from Albert Einstein, and that quote is, "The most incomprehensible thing about the world is its comprehensibility." So what are your thoughts about this particular quote or supposed quote from Einstein?
So I think you said it right, supposed quote, because this is the quote as it's come to us in popular parlance now, which is actually, as far as I could gather, is what somebody else's words were of what he meant in a quote from Physics and Reality in the Franklin Institute Journal in March of 1936. And the actual smaller quote, it's a larger quote. The entire quote is much longer and much more involved. But the summary of it is: the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility. The fact that it is comprehensible is a miracle. Now, I don't know what he meant by miracle in that quote, but so the popular quotation of it or reinterpretation of it does communicate that it is quite difficult to understand why the universe is not just some haphazard chaos, that there is a way that we can actually order it, put it into order and understand it. But that's no reason to just say that, oh, it's such a mystery. Like, you had two that come out of this discussion as one guy who basically said, in effect, I have absolute knowledge of the thing, of how this universe is constructed and its mind, and I know that, and I know that God, exists because of that. And then another person whose conclusion was, I have no idea, but it's amazing and it's a miracle. It's exactly what Einstein said. So I would say if we really dissected the subject matter and talked about it, we would all agree that there is some sort of large amount of ignorance that we have regarding all of these subjects, that it's very difficult to comprehend, which is why this episode, I think, was hard to really comprehend what they're even saying because of the language that was used. But there's no reason from that to say, put our hands up and just say, well, I don't know, I think we can say some stuff about it, and we can at least give people the idea of putting it in a way that they can go away going, oh, okay, I understand the issues. I can't understand. I don't have answers, but at least I understand what the issues are and I understand what the history is. Putting it in a way that's, and I think that's the Einstein quote is interesting. And I haven't done a lot of reading on the history and the meaning of it, the context of even that journal article. But I can say that's a subject that comes up quite a bit on Unbelievable, is that idea of why there's something rather than nothing, why there's order rather than disorder, and why it's comprehensible. So I'll just leave it at that. I don't know if there's anything more to say than I think we can all agree that is a true. The quote does say something that we probably all agree with. It's a complicated subject.
It is a complicated subject. I think I would also say that my own view on comprehensibility is the fact that the universe is comprehensible in part, and I don't know whether the universe is entirely comprehensible. Certainly, when I was listening to this show, I didn't think that everything that was said was comprehensible. So if you accept that that's part of the universe, I didn't think it was all comprehensible. But I don't know that the universe will ever be entirely comprehensible to us, whatever that would mean. Different people have different abilities and capabilities, and I'm not sure that any one person could ever understand all of the universe, whatever that would mean. But if the universe is comprehensible in part, I think it is reasonable to accept that comprehensibility without insisting on the origin of that comprehensibility, because that surely is a separate question, right? To say that the universe is comprehensible, I don't have to draw a specific conclusion about why a particular bit of comprehensibility is achievable by me.
Yeah, and even to go further, what they do is to say, well, that must mean there's a God. There's certain things where we have to starting points that we all have to agree on, and we have to agree on the ground rules, and if we don't, we might as well not discuss it. That's my thought. I feel like maybe in this discussion that there really wasn't any agreement on ground rules. It was just like kind of come in and free for all, And I don't feel like there was ever a meeting of the minds on the whole subject, if you were to ask me about the episode. So
I think that's right. And in fact, on comprehensibility, the thing that they didn't discuss that I would have rather seen more discussion over is what rules make the universe comprehensible, and where do we think they come from? These were two reasonably well-versed philosophers, much more so than I am. I mean, they discuss philosophers that I've never read, but they didn't talk about what rules we use to comprehend the universe, while insisting that this debate was going to get to the heart of making sense of the world. And I didn't think that the conversation on philosophy helped me make sense of the world in any particular way, but maybe the listeners will have a different response. So you had some preliminary thoughts about David Bentley Hart, and you pointed out in our run-up that David is Eastern Orthodox. So tell me what your thoughts were in general about David.
I'm not familiar with David at all. I think he's been on Unbelievable before. I think I remember him. I don't remember the subject matter. And all my recollection in my head is that I on his previous one, I thought he was interesting. I will say with this one, in listening to it 4 times and kind of, realizing that he was Eastern Orthodox and having a bit of experience with talking to people that are Eastern Orthodox and that type of thing. And then realizing that, as he said, he made a comment that we should begin and end with Plotinus, that he's a Neoplatonist. I think those are important things to take into account. That's what he's bringing to the table. Justin often talks about presuppositions. So I think that's important. And those are things that don't come out often in the discussions on unbelievables. You don't really know what their presuppositions are. You don't know what framework they're coming from. To have an Eastern Orthodox who's a Neoplatonist come and have a discussion with, I don't know anything about Raymond's, I know he's not a dualist. At least I think that's what he said. And so I don't know what framework he's coming from. But all I can say is, after listening to David on this one 4 times, is that it wasn't clear, and it wasn't any clearer after the 4 times, that he uses a lot of big words. He apologized several times that it was entirely his fault that Raymond couldn't understand what he was saying. It's possible he believed that it was entirely his fault, but my feeling is that at least in this subject, he came across as quite pompous and a bit smug, and he introduced so many terms that once you get above 3 or 4 new terms that you haven't learned before, you start to tune it out, and it just starts to become gibberish. And I really felt that way. And Justin said at the beginning, well, you're going to have to get your philosophy dictionary out. And I did take mine out, and I have referenced it more than a few times. And I have had to do a lot of reading and in realizing it is a vast subject. But you don't need to – my philosophy has always been, if you can't take a subject – complicated as it is, if you can't summarize it and synthesize it and describe it to somebody who's a layman or who's not an expert in the subject, and have them at least appreciate the main subjects and be able to go away and saying, okay, now I know what the problem is, I don't have an answer. If you can't do that, if you can't explain that, that means you probably don't understand it yourself, or that you haven't gone through that step of synthesis in your head to where you can take it and understand it enough to explain it to somebody else in a way that they can understand. And that's one of the things I do for a living. I'm an engineer, and I have to take these technical concepts and put them in a way that upper management can understand. So I have to really process it and reformulate it until it's in a format that's like 3 points in a poem. So I feel like that's maybe what David Bentley Hart failed to do, is that he just threw out a bunch of terms, talked a lot, and said a lot of stuff, but in the end, it wasn't, in my opinion, of a lot of value.
I think Raymond certainly had that problem. He said on a number of occasions that, or words to the effect that he didn't quite get where David was going. Right?
Yeah.
So, what is our big lead-in then to this conversation?
Well, I think we just talked about it, and I think that's the challenge, and the goal is, how do you make a subject that really, as you start pulling the string, becomes infinite, becomes so vast that you just want to throw up your hands and go play softball. How you do that, how you take that and not make it so complicated, how do you take that and make it simple such that you understand at least what the issues are. Not that you can answer all of them, but at least you can understand, okay, this is what we're talking about, which is why, as we came up in the run-up of this, maybe even just focusing on 2 main issues. One is epistemology. How do we know what we know? How can we rely on our senses, that type of thing? How do we ever get to what we know, and how reliable is it? And then ontology. What is the universe? What is? I think those are really, I mean, this topic is so vast, and the history of it is so enormous, and there are so many players, so many subjects, so many ways of describing it over all the history, that we could easily and quickly become lost. And so I think just the issue is let's talk about those 2 topics. Let's talk about what is, and this is what the presocratics did. This is, I think, the important lead into it, is that we didn't really talk they didn't talk a ton about the presocratics. And the presocratics, they have, this is really the start of science. This is really the start of what they were doing, is they were coming from the old Sumerian and Babylonian and Egyptian and Greek explanation of the gods and what the gods did and all that kind of thing. It's a lot of myth. the mythology. It's where you have all of the myth, taking and stripping that away, stripping the gods away. Not saying they didn't say, the presocratics didn't say that there wasn't some sort of other world or gods. They just said, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to actually have reasoned arguments for. We're going to try to figure out what the world is, and have reasoned arguments for it. They didn't. Doesn't mean they were right. It just meant that this is the beginning of what we would call science, beginning of being able to take out the superstition and the gods and try to describe something in a way that doesn't lean on that as an explanatory mechanism.
That has had a huge amount of repercussion down the years, right? In fact, this is where the empirical method comes from, isn't it? And as far as I can tell, the empirical method has been, to date, our most successful method of understanding the world around us. So that is right down to our epistemology. How do we know what we know?
Absolutely. Yeah, and if I might add something, that in the past, and this is what I think happened in this podcast, is you had one person just making assertions and another person saying they had no idea. And you can't just make assertions. There were no reasoned arguments for why David Bentley Hart's position was. He didn't make any reasoned arguments. He just said, he made statements. It is more logical that this all comes from some sort of mind, right? That's not you. I can't falsify that. I just accept it? Do I just say, okay, you're right? He didn't do what the presocratics did. The presocratics came along and said, okay, we're going to talk about this and we're going to reason it out. We're going to talk about, okay, what are the elements, the principal elements of the universe, and they're going to try to, explain to you why air is the principal element, or why water is the principal element, or why fire is which is what Heraclitus believed, that in the Stoics, that fire is the principal element. But they would tell you why that is. They didn't just make the assertion. And I think that's important, is that what happens a lot on Unbelievable is just mere assertions, where it should be a discussion where we're actually articulating and giving the justification, the reasoned argument for why we're saying what we're saying, and which this lacked in this episode completely.
So maybe we should turn a little bit then to the problem that David Bentley Hart has with beginning with Plotinus and ending with Plotinus. Who was Plotinus for the listeners?
So Plotinus was historians credit Plotinus with being and this is in retrospect, so that there wasn't anything called Platonists and Middle Platonists and Neoplatonists. These are just terms in retrospect that we assign to certain eras or epochs of that. And so obviously all of them regarded themselves as true interpreters of Plato. And that gets back to this whole idea, too, of not to wax eloquent and talk about postmodernism, but, do we have access to what Plato really meant? And that's part of the discussion, because Plotinus was a Neoplatonist. In retrospect, we call him that. But he obviously believed and felt that he was correctly interpreting Plato. And so he is a philosopher in 3rd century BCE or CE, whereas you have Plato is 7 centuries removed from him. And so that's not to say he couldn't have interpreted him properly, but the point being is that he's post-Christian, post-Christianity, maybe right at the beginning of when Christianity became the state. Right in the cusp of when it became the Roman accepted religion of the Roman Empire, and so he comes along and he tries to, in the context of Epicureanism and Stoicism and the ancient materialist or we call it corporealist thought, he comes out and says, okay, what is the world, and how is it composed? And how is it constructed? And he is a Platonist in the sense that he takes the world of forms or the world of ideas, and that's a large part of his philosophy. But mainly what he did is he divided the world between, or divided a system of the universe, of the cosmos, between an invisible world and a phenomenal world. And the way it worked is you had the one that David Bentley Hart talked about, the good, and that is everything, and that is the cause of the rest of reality. And then so from that you have the nous, or the mind or the intellect, and then the soul. And so the way that it would work is that you have the pure consciousness, or this mind, this one, is the cause, and the effect is the emergence of the living material universe, and that in between, mediating that, is the soul. And I don't really understand it all. I don't know how it all works, but they had this idea of it proceeds in this logical fashion by a process called emanation. Just like the sun, you have emanating from the sun heat and light, and so that's kind of the way it works. And so our goal as humans is to return to this one through contemplation, through transcendental existentialism. This is the other aspect too. Is as I read through this, I realized that experts on Plato, there's not an agreement on whether Plato was a dualist or a monist. And to talk about those terms, dualism comes much later in Western philosophy, but that monism are there two materials, two substances that make up the universe, or is there just one? Is it just physical material, or is it physical material and some sort of spiritual or immaterial, like mind? And so the Neoplatonists, or the Plotinus, tried to navigate the middle road between monism, which would just be pure. Is the world just pure mind, or is it pure material? And dualism, and really he was interacting with Gnosticism, and the idea of like an evil god created the physical universe type thing, which he was against both. And he was also against the atomists, of just saying that the physical atoms and the aggregation of them somehow could explain life or soul or spirit, or thought, or memory. That you couldn't have that all come from just physical little items that are aggregate. So I don't know if that gives that's kind of a summary of Plotinus, but
I think it's an excellent summary. Let me ask you a question as a mechanical engineer. You do some work for the Department of Energy. You work in a nuclear field. You were and are a qualified mechanical engineer. Have you encountered in your life anything that you think cannot be explained through the physical laws that we encounter every day? Does Plotinus give us something that we don't have through a material monism?
I don't believe so. I don't believe at least anything that we. So this is where I think this whole discussion comes into sort of maybe a God of the gaps thing. So there may be things that I observe in the physical. So I'll use an example. My specialty is bulk solids, and so you get bulk solids that have the particles have different sizes, and once you get to a certain size, a submicronic size, things begin to behave bizarrely, because the forces and the things interacting are the forces. So, for example, you'll have maybe agglomeration occurring because when you have these tiny small particles, like all submicron fines, you have the electrostatic forces and maybe the form or the shape of the particle, and you have these small, they call van der Waals forces. They're very small forces. Those at that level, overcome the forces of gravity, for example. And so it's difficult to understand because we're talking at this level of that's, it's when you start getting to, it's like the Horton Hears the Who, when you start to get down, you have these little who's that are on this little tiny flower, and as you start getting smaller and smaller, you have that microscopic universe, and then you have the macroscopic universe, and things start to kind of go haywire because we're using what we experience on our level, whatever you call that, and you're trying to look at everything, explain it, and so there's some mystery about it, right? It's hard to understand. It's hard to see. Oh, okay, what's going on here? Why is it acting this way? You'll have these bulk solids that are, a agglomeration of small particles that sometimes all together as aggregate, it acts like a liquid. Sometimes it acts like a solid. Sometimes it acts like a gas. And so I think that's maybe a good analogy to say, well, there's things we don't understand. We don't have all the instruments and the equipment to really be able to measure things. A lot of things in my my field, you can't really know. You just have to do experiments. So you can't take, for example, measurement on a powder and go, this is how it's going to act, because it's acting too with an environment. So you have hoppers at certain angles, certain size of the outlets. There's certain sizes and then certain angles of and all that interacts with this powder, and you can't just take measurements in the powder and say it's going to act like that. You have to actually just carry out experiments and see, okay, here's how it's going to act. And then it's difficult because you sometimes can't do that. You have to do it on a lab scale, and so maybe it's a different scale, and then the results aren't representative. And so maybe it's a good example of how there's a lot of mystery involved, and I could just throw up my hands and just say, well, God did it, or it's energy, or whatever. But there are a lot of things going on we just don't understand. We don't have the ability to actually measure everything and actually even know what all the parameters that are playing into it are. So I'll say I don't think in my experience, my 45 years on this planet, I don't think I would say I am a materialist. I'm honest, and I think that everything can be explained in physical terms. And I'm not going to throw my hands up and say, well, because I don't understand, there must be this other substance or this other thing going on that I don't understand, and so I'm going to give it a term. That doesn't mean I understand everything that's happening in the physical world, just like in my in powder and bulk solids, that because I don't understand everything that's going on doesn't mean I just introduce a new term that fills that in. It just means that I don't have all the knowledge, and so I'll do what I can and come up with what I can to explain, and then maybe have some theories about why it might be. But it's always based on what I've experienced and what I know. It's not based on some, grasping at straws and being like, okay, I'll just invent a new term and and throw it out there, and that'll explain it all. I think that's what's actually kind of happening with a lot of these discussions.
Creating terms and throwing them out there. That resonated with me a little bit in regard to Platonic forms. So tell me a little bit for the listeners, because we talked a lot about Platonic form in the last couple of weeks, but for the listeners, what are Platonic forms, so that we can talk about the importance of introducing a concept like Platonic forms, and how, if we could experiment with them, and if we can't, why it might be good to leave them behind. So what is a Platonic form?
So the idea of the Platonic forms, or the ideas, is that behind what we see in reality, so a circle, for example, it's an archetypal type thing where it's like a shadow, right? So the shadow, there's the real thing, which is whatever's casting the shadow, and the shadow is what we see. So one of the examples in Plato for this is in the analogy of the cave. And you're familiar with that, the analogy of the cave? Yeah. And so the idea that and you get the movie The Matrix comes from this. The idea is that you have these slaves that are chained up, and they can only see forward, and they can only see on the cave wall. And behind the cave wall, there are these trees and people and things, animals going by, and there's a light behind them, a fire behind them that's casting the shadow onto the wall. But the slaves, who've never seen anything else, only see the shadows, and so they think, a goat is looks like it's this black, dark thing, and it's shaped like that, and that's what that really is. And so you get from that is the idea of he represents the philosopher kings, and the philosopher king's job is to go and free these people. And so the philosopher king is the one that gets freed, and he goes out into the real world, out there, and gets to see all these trees and animals and things that are being paraded about, and that they can hear these things behind, but they can't turn their heads and see it. And so the one that gets freed, he goes out and he sees, oh my word, I need to go tell my friends down in the cave about the real world. And he goes down and he tries to tell them, and they think he's crazy, and they try to kill him. And so there's a bunch of stuff going on with that analogy. That's just a very short retelling of it, but the point being is that it illustrates that the forms, the idea of the forms of the world of forms or ideas, is that there is the real world, and the real world is mind. And this is where the experts on Plato don't agree. You have probably the majority of them, I would say the majority of them say that Platonism is dualistic, and that there are two different worlds. There are others that say no, that Plato was a monist, and the what's real, what's true, is mind, and mind creates this structure, and mind creates the physical world, and it's whether or not the physical world actually exists is debatable. They would say that probably it's all in the mind. And George Berkeley, who's a Scottish during the Enlightenment, I think the Scottish Enlightenment. He came and said the same thing, that basically everything is mind, and that nothing exists without mind. That mind is required for anything to exist, and it only exists in the mind. And so the idea of forms and the concept of ideas and forms is that it's archetypal. It's like the difference between something casting the shadow on the shadow. And so what we see may be just the shadow, but what's behind it is something real in the mind. And so there's this perfect circle, there's a perfect numbers, there's the perfect beauty, the perfect good, and all those types of things that maybe we can't see or measure, but that we know exist. And so that kind of maybe gives an idea. It talks a lot about like truth, goodness, beauty, liberty, equality, justice. Those are all things, in numbers and mathematics. Those are all things that and metaphysics comes out of that. The whole idea of metaphysics is the idea of is it all just material? If it's all just material, then how do we have the concept of beauty? That type of thing. And so I think it's super complicated and complex. But at the same time, I think it's just grasping with how our brains interface with or take and process with everything else. Because the brain, I think, is like a computer, and so we could talk about our artificial intelligence or computer programming, and maybe kind of chip away at what's really going on with the ideas and the forms.
To summarize Platonic forms just for a second. A Platonic form would be the perfect representation of whatever we might be talking about at the time. I guess it could be beauty or justice or whatever, but would Platonic forms extend, like the perfect computer program? Is that, do Platonic forms extend to everything that we talk about?
I don't think so. I used to think that's what they taught, and I read somewhere, I don't remember where, but that's not the idea. It's not that everything there's not like a perfect salt shaker, that type of thing. I don't know to what limit it goes, to be honest with you. And I don't know that anybody does. I don't know that Plato has written that much to actually, and didn't write in terms that would allow us to get at that. So I don't think, from what I understand, that's the idea, because if you take that and pull the string on that, you'd be like, this is ridiculous. Like, how do you have, and then how do you get at like fantasy, right? Like fantasy, a unicorn, for example. Well, and somebody might say, well, you have an idea of a horse, and you have an idea of like something with horns, and so you can't create something out of nothing. There is an idea or a form behind it, or forms behind it, and our brains have that, and that exists. But they would say that's what's real. That's the real universe, And so if you go to the movie The Matrix, I try to think about, okay, so if I use that as an example, what was when Neo ate the blue pill, was where he went, where the people were plugged into the Matrix, is that the real world? And the rest of it's illusory. And I think that's the point, right? Is that the real world is mind. And that mind is where he goes. And that within that is these forms, or not the forms, but where we live, there's the forms, and then what we live in is the shadows. It's illusory. It's all illusory. It's all just the construct that our brains make. So I don't really understand how it all works. I don't know of any treatment that really gives a description of it such that it really answers that question. So I don't know. I just know that there's some shadow type, there's an archetype, and there's a perfect circle somewhere, and that's how our minds, have the idea of a circle. But I think intuitively, that doesn't make any sense, because I believe that we don't have an idea of anything innately. We form ideas based on our experience with the actual with just living and what we interface with. If you use the computer analogy, I think that's how we form our ideas. I'll tell you the story about, we were talking earlier about in the South here, my wife, she's a substitute teacher, and this is maybe a good segue into empiricism. She was in the lunchroom and had a science teacher that was telling her about it was actually somebody they knew, and they had a 5-year-old son, and the son said to the dad that, "Hey, Dad, look at that dog," and the dad said, "That's not a dog, that's a goat." And the funny thing about that is that the 5-year-old son he'd never seen, and his parents had never shown him, or he'd never had experienced a goat. So the closest thing for him to a goat was a dog. He knew about a dog. They probably had a dog and had 4 legs. It was about that size. So he thought that must be a dog. And he didn't have some perfect idea of a goat in his head, and he couldn't have known that until his father said, "No, that's not a dog, son. That's actually a goat. A goat is different than a dog, And so I'll just leave that, because I think it's a funny story that really illustrates the truth, in my opinion, of empiricism.
It is that I wanted to address next too, because if we claimed that there was a perfect representation of any particular idea, like justice or beauty or the color red, or whatever, if indeed Platonic forms would extend to a perfect color, I don't know. But whatever we think they extend to, it seems to me that sort of perfection probably cannot be investigated in any meaningful way. So if we had a beauty detector, which might in some sense be possible, right? We certainly have computer programs that do facial recognition and that sort of thing, and we might come up with a computer program that understood beauty, right? So there might be some idea of regularity involved in beauty, because we often think that symmetry is important when we think about beauty. So golden ratios is another thing that might apply. But could we ever experimentally, in some non-equivocal way, say that a particular thing is absolutely the most perfect, beautiful object, for instance? It seemed to me that all we could ever say is, this is the best we've done so far. So how would we ever say that any particular representation of a Platonic form was itself the perfect representation? How would we get there?
Well, and so I think David Bentley Hart might argue, and this is where we get into, that's their argument for why there has to be a God, because we can't. The only way we can get at that logically is by there is something outside objective, and this is where the argument always goes, is since I can't figure it out, and since we can't agree on it, I've got to come up with some external objective thing that defines that. Bam, you've got a God, And I think that's just lazy. I think it's lazy. I think it's reductionistic. I think it's unnecessary. It doesn't really. It's like you said. There's no. How do you disprove that? You just make the statement and it makes it true. I can't argue with it. So why even discuss? And then if you just say, well, it makes more sense, to me that's the case. Okay, it's an argument from incredulity. Okay, it doesn't make sense. You can't make sense of it. Why? That's why I appreciated the position of Raymond Tallis, was that he at least was honest up front and said, I just don't know. I just know it's amazing, which I go back to say, why did you write a book about that? Because that's not anything new to the conversation. Yes, it is amazing and it is hard to understand, but you can't possibly disprove that. You can't demonstrate that that's not the case. So I don't know where to go with that.
I don't either. If I insisted that there was a God, and let's even say, for the sake of this argument, that there is a God, and that God said, here is this thing that is the most perfect representation of some Platonic form like beauty. And let's say that we had 3 opinions on that Platonic form of beauty. So the 3 opinions would be, one person says God is right, another person says God is wrong, and a third person says, well, I just don't know. Other than just accepting that some other intelligence said it was the case, I'm not sure how it would be demonstrated that that intelligence couldn't be wrong at some point in the future, or even change its mind, right? I mean, we could say that one of the properties of God is that he never changes his mind, but I'm not sure that that advances the conversation any toward understanding Platonic forms, or sort of the Christian use of claiming that God has all of the objective properties of Platonic forms.
Yeah, I don't really know. It's this discussion when it comes into these realms where it becomes squidgy. I mean, like you can't disprove it, and you can't even really actually talk about it. Because we're using, well, it makes more sense, or it's more probable that this is the case given this, and Justin often goes back to this description of, well, this argument of God is makes much more sense to me, and it's more probable that that's the case than that all this order and all this came from matter in motion, and that's, just because it's difficult to explain and we don't have all the answers. It's like I was talking about with bulk solids. I'm not going to not come up with things that and try to come up with things that actually model what's happening. I'll have holes, but I can at least come up with something that's not just, well, it's mystery, and there's this being that has these qualities and these characteristics that explain it. That doesn't do anything. It doesn't add any value. It's not something, maybe this goes back to his presuppositionalism that he always talks about, where it's just given that he that he has a presupposition and then they just go on it, But if that's where we're going to go, I've always thought presuppositionalism is just pointless, because why even talk? If we're going to sit here and just talk about whose presupposition is more probable, like we have to start somewhere. We have to start somewhere where we agree on, and I think we agree on experience. We agree on what we can measure, and that's why science, I think, is very, very important. I'm not a scientism. What's somebody who
advocate
who
of
is
scientism? I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not,
What
do they
is
have a name for the person who is an advocate of scientism? Anyways, I don't think it explains. I don't know that I think that science is going to one day explain everything. So I wouldn't go to that length. But right now, that's the only thing we have. That's the only method that we have that we can all agree on. and for those things that are mysterious behind it, we don't need a God to try to fill in that so we can explain it. We can say we don't know yet, and that's it. So that's why Raymond, I appreciate his approach of I just don't know. But my question is, why write a book on that?
Yeah. Well, and so it's also the case, I mentioned sort of ascribing all possible Platonic forms to God, right? God is perfectly just, God is all knowledgeable, God is perfectly powerful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is in fact the case that not all Christians think that God is perfectly representative of all Platonic forms. But in your reading, do you think that it's the case that this idea of Platonic forms is where some Christians got the notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, all-transcendent, yada, yada, yada? Does that sort of Platonism play into first century Christianity?
I don't know on the way you asked the question. I'm not sure about that. I do know, though, that and this is one thing I remember as a Christian that I didn't actually know, now that I learned it afterwards, is that the amount of borrowing that went on. That being said, is that the Stoics disappeared in a sense because they all became Christian, with the Roman Empire having the Christianity become a state religion. But the Stoics, just for their ontology, they relied heavily on Heraclitus, and it came from the presocratics. So their idea, they believed that fire was the principal material of the universe. They believed in what was said by the presocratics about the logos, and so that all crept in through Philo and through the thought. So it probably wasn't directly through Philo, but what Philo wrote. Philo was a Platonist, and he was the Platonist who merged Hebrew thought with Greek thought. And so he merged things like from Proverbs 8, where he talks about wisdom, the personification of wisdom, where the idea of a high priest. What you read in the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written by a Platonist, and that's the idea where you have the idea of the forms. You can just read the book of Hebrews, and you can get a very good idea when he talks about the temple and the high priest and all those kind of things. Those are all forms and types that we have, and so all of that crept in, and I think Paul, in fact, was a Platonist as well. But his, as we talked about before the show, his ideas were much less sophisticated than, for example, the writer of the book of John or the writer of the book of Hebrews. The thoughts in those and the book of Revelation, whoever wrote that, there were a lot of ideas that it's just littered with the presocratics. It's littered with Platonism. It's littered with just all sorts of stuff that was going on at the time. And so, yes, I think Christianity did import all of that into it, and it's part and parcel of Christianity. But to what level and whether how that all works, I don't know. But I do know that it's at least demonstrated by the experts that is kind of how it worked. It came from the presocratics and Heraclitus to Stoicism to Philo, and all the stuff that was happening at that time into Christianity.
Fair enough. We are getting maybe close to putting a wrap on the very deep philosophical part of this show, which I think is the part that the vast majority of our listeners will ask, how did that help me understand the world, right? That was sort of the promise of the title of the episode, right?
Yeah.
We're Logos
Yes.
Mind, making sense of the world, right?
Yes, right, yeah.
And I'm not sure that when we got through Platonic forms and when we discussed Plotinus, I'm not sure that was actually beneficial to anyone that heard the show about how to rationalize the world. We didn't actually walk away with a way to guarantee that the world has any actual connection to Platonic forms, or that those Platonic forms are particularly illuminating if we looked at two pictures, right? You and I together, and they're both fine works of art. I don't know that we would necessarily agree that one or the other was a closer representation to a Platonic form of beauty, right? Because one of the things that's missing from a Platonic form is not just that we don't know what the perfect representation of a Platonic form would be, but how do we even graduate along the continuum toward a Platonic form? If you and I can look at two paintings and disagree about which one is closest to the Platonic form of perfection, whatever that would be, we would need some way to graduate along that continuum. And David didn't get me there. I didn't come away with a sense that David could even help me get there. Here's how to understand a Platonic form so that as you look at the world, you get better and better at understanding what is closer and closer to that Platonic form. But at the end of the show, sort of down toward the last commercial break, they start talking about logos and John chapter 1. And so the show takes a rather violent swerve here. But what do you think was important in regard to the shift from philosophy to this very particular discussion of logos and Jesus being representative?
Yeah, it was sort of jarring. I would agree. It didn't really flow. And I think in recollecting how it went, I think it was sort of foisted on it by Justin. I think he wanted to talk about that, and that was where at the end of the episode we get this idea of, oh, what's logos? Oh, okay, let's talk about that. And where does that come from? And listeners, maybe some listeners had never realized that there was such a thing outside of the book of John, because I know as a Christian that we don't talk about that. We didn't talk about that. It was just, it was if John 1 came as if nowhere, and it was completely innovative, and it wasn't. It was innovative, but it wasn't. The enfleshment part was the innovation. So it was jarring. I didn't feel like it flowed. The majority of the conversation in retrospect was about consciousness, right? And the problem of consciousness. And so we haven't talked about that too much in our treatment of it, because I think that's part of the discussion, but it's more, that's why I think it's, the epistemology and the ontology is when we get to consciousness, and this is what we haven't talked about yet, and maybe going on a little rabbit trail, but how anthropocentric our discussions are. We don't ever talk about dolphins or chimpanzees, or what that would mean to them and mind to them, because they have brains and they appear to have minds. They appear to be able to recognize things and even have language and recognize when someone dies and can mourn. And there's lots of things that are very similar to higher level primates or bigger brained organisms that are like us. But, we don't ever talk about that. We just talk about this consciousness and what does it mean? And then we go into this logos, and it's like, so they talked a lot about consciousness, very little about logos. We've talked, not a lot about consciousness. We've talked a lot about Platonism, haven't really talked about what logos is, and really, so I don't know how to answer the question, just in saying that this is an example of how many different strains and different ways you can go with this whole discussion. And I agree. I don't think at the end, with logos mind and making sense of the world, I don't think there was any sense made of the world after this episode of Unbelievable. And hopefully somebody can go away from this and may have made a little more sense of the actual issues at hand.
Well, okay, so maybe before we wrap this, then, we should talk a little bit about the fact that logos, the idea of powerful words, that idea exists in history prior to John chapter 1. The only innovation is actually just ascribing this word to the Jesus character.
Yes. So if you actually look, and I haven't read all of Philo on it, but I have read a bit of Philo, and I have read about him, and I know that he has what he's dealing with is a lot of influence on the writer of Hebrews, for example. That's very that's very apparent. But the term logos, it goes all the way back. I'm trying to think of the early Greek writers. This is back when it was mythos. They had myth, Homer. So you have logos that goes back to that. Logos, in the sense that we're talking about now, goes back to Heraclitus, and that's 6th century BC. So he's one of the presocratics, and so they referenced him in the episode. They didn't talk a lot about him, but he has quite an extensive philosophy or treatment of that term logos, and it's a very broad term. In Greek philosophy, it means many different things. One of which is word, but not word in just the sense of one word, but like an expression of thought is really what it is. It comes from the verb to order. Or to collect or select, catalog in succession, arrange together in an orderly sequence. But it's also used to talk about something just said or stated, statement, an expression of thought. And they use it as well for just the idea of rationality or reasoning. And then it becomes this sort of personification of the unifying principle of the universe in Heraclitus. And so it's got a long pedigree, and it didn't come out of nowhere in the Book of John. That's important, I think, for Christians to understand, because I know as a Christian I thought it just like, oh wow, it's so cool, that's really neat, and look at, I can relate that to Genesis 1. It sounds exactly like it, And he's actually the writer of the Book of John, the Gospel of John. There are tons of ideas behind it, tons of history behind it that you won't know at first glance. And it's this whole discussion. I mean, I'll just read it if you don't mind.
Please.
The John 1 through 3 and then 14. And so apparently David Bentley Hart has a translation that Tom Wright doesn't agree with, but I'll use his words just because I think there are a lot of words, there are terms. So if you go back to the presocratics, there are certain terms that they are very used quite a bit. In the presocratics, one is cosmos, and that is just the orderly organization of everything, the arrangement of everything. We get cosmology from it. We get cosmetology from it. And the other one is physis, nature. Arche is another one. That's the origin or the beginning principle. In Latin, it's principium. And then you have logos. So you have all these terms, and those all appear in this passage. So I'll just read it. In the beginning, or at the origin, anarche in Greek, was the logos. So was is very important because that's the word for ontology. In the beginning was the word. The word was. It existed. That's really what it's saying. And the logos was with God, and the logos was God. He, and it personifies it, it's in the masculine, he was in the beginning with God. He was with God in the beginning, or anarche, at the origin. Through him, all things were made. So you have this idea of making, of producing. Without him, and that's material existence. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. So it's like they're repeating again that there's nothing that didn't come through him, that wasn't made through him, that didn't become through him. And then you get to 14, the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. So that word became, and this is a debate that came between the presocratics, notably between Heraclitus and Parmenides, is the idea of whether there is such a thing as becoming. Because, and then this is the idea of change. And this is one of the things that wasn't talked about at all on the podcast, which is all the presocratics were trying to deal with change. How could you have change? And we get all these scientific things that the conservation of matter, the conservation of energy, all those things come from the presocratics. Atomism, that comes from the presocratics. A lot of the rules that we still use in science and laws come out of just them reasoning it out. They didn't have to measure it. They just thought about it, and they thought about, okay, how do we have change? And so you find that in the book of John here. He's talking about the logos, this rational organizing principle that everything was created with, became flesh. So it was, and then it became. So it's pretty innovative. But at the same time, if you don't understand all of the thoughts and the history that he's drawing on and the philosophy that happened, you can't understand what's being said here. So I don't know I don't remember how I understood it as a Christian, but it certainly wasn't informed with all of that. And you'd have to really learn. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that when I was a Christian, I didn't have some of this history.
Yeah,
and
I didn't. I certainly didn't.
Yeah, and I understood logos to be that personality that was with God at the foundation of the world. So this is sort of Jesus in the role of creator, which is part of the common Christian story, right? You get God in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. But later on in John chapter 1, we sort of understand that to be God in his personality as Jesus, and you don't have any of this history that goes along with helping people understand that the only innovation here actually is ascribing this idea of logos to a person. And so the claim actually is not new, right? This idea of logos isn't new. And while there is some innovation there, it doesn't, the history is actually harmful to the story. And, it's hard to take the story as seriously after you understand that this idea of logos came about well prior, 6 centuries prior to John chapter 1.
Yeah, and I think John, too, is informed a lot by what was happening, what you see in Philo. I don't know that he directly maybe read Philo, but whatever the case may be, the subject was being discussed, and those were the ideas being bantered about. And so you have this Hebrew mind that's, the Hellenistic Jews they were very Jewish, but they were in a Greek context. And so you have in Philo, you have him calling, the Logos of the eternal God. You have him calling the Logos the name of God, the firstborn of God, the second God, the heavenly Adam, the high priest, who's the mediator between God and man. It's God's eternal thought which created the world. So you have already in Philo all of these concepts of and then you have him marrying it with the Hebrew concept of like I told you about the wisdom that you find in Proverbs 8. And so you have Genesis 1 and Proverbs 8, and you have Philo being playful with that and assigning that this logos that comes from, has a pedigree, a long pedigree, and then you have the Christians come along and say, oh, that archetype, that's actually Jesus. And that's what you have in Christianity, is you have basically Jesus is the archetype, he is the archetype of it. He is the fulfillment of all the types. So you have Moses, you have Adam, you have the high priest, you have all these things, and Jesus is the temple. Jesus is the temple, And so you have the innovation is that, Jesus is all these things. He is everything. And, so Jesus becomes that substitute, that term that we throw. Like today, we have people say, I believe in energy, So Jesus was they personified it, and it became an enfleshment in this person, in this legend, really, is what Jesus is. I believe there was a Jesus, but it's this perfect, ideal person, right? And they just now had a name, and it had an individual, and that was their Messiah, right? And so, but all of those things, they're not created out of nothing. They come from a strain of thought that was already happening.
Right. And so they can't quite claim the innovation that it appears that they could claim in Sunday school.
No, it's not. Point is, and I think actually probably any Christian that was informed Christian would be able to go, oh, okay, because most of the Old Testament, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of Babylonian thought and Sumerian thought. You go to Genesis, all those legends, the flood comes from Sumerian and Babylonian. It's just a repetition, almost exactly the same of what already existed. So, and a lot of Christians don't know that either. They believe it's like something that's completely unique, and actually it's not. It's just legend and mythos, like I told you about, like the Homer. It's all there already, and it's just Christians or Jews are taking that and using it for their own purposes.
So, for those of you Christians listening to this show, you heard it here first. The Old Testament is fake news. So we have not talked about consciousness much. So we have talked about epistemology a great deal. We have not talked about ontology or why we think we can trust the epistemologies that we hold, whatever they are, because we may indeed hold different epistemologies. Some of us may be substance dualists, and others of us monists, and those monists can be split into further camps of universal consciousness as a monist, or of materialism as a monist. Right? We can divide ourselves in lots of silos. But what causes us to be able to trust any particular epistemology that we have? Maybe we should spend 1 or 2 minutes there as we wind down. What is your ontology, Doug Hoxworth?
I would say my idea of what is formed based on what I experience. I don't know what else I could use as a basis for that. And so that's why I can't feel comfortable saying the whole universe is actually at base and at ground mind. I don't know what that would mean. I'm not sure what value that would have to say that. Because my understanding of mind is that I have a brain that does certain calculations and has neurons, and certain things happen, all of which we could, hook my brain up to an fMRI and see that it's firing and that it's doing certain things. It doesn't explain everything, but I don't know. I don't know by saying that universe is mind would even mean, or how that would add value. So my approach is I can only I have to start somewhere, and I have to say that my brain, that what I experience through my brain is where I start. And I understand that, I'm colorblind, so I understand that people see colors differently than I. And is that apple really red? I don't know. I don't know that that's important to talk too much about that. All I know is that, and this is where this whole idea of reality and ontology comes into, is it what we're seeing? Everything comes through us, mediated through our brains. And so can I make any real statements about what, any statements that are objective? I don't know. But I know that I could be with somebody that has the normal faculties that can see, and that may be not colorblind. We can both look at an apple on a table and go, okay, you describe it and then I'll describe it, and we can agree on most of it. We won't be able to say the color exactly and express what the color means, and we can't even express that in words. But the point is we can both it's objective in the sense that we can both talk about something that's actually there, that it's not just a figment of both of our minds. It's not illusory. Otherwise, if it's illusory, then we couldn't agree on there's an apple there. We couldn't even have a rational conversation about it. There would be no way to communicate with anybody, and there would be no way to interact and survive in such a world where everything was illusory. And so I think just the base, I think if we just kind of do an exercise like that, obviously there is some sense to where what's mediated is mediating something that's actually there. It may not be exactly as we see it, but it is close. I'll just say that. So my idea of ontology is that as I said before, I am likely a monist. I believe that everything is material. If I were a dualist, I would not be a substance dualist. I would be a property dualist. And so that's where I would put myself on that spectrum. Likely, I not, a lot of this is just really it's groping in the dark, and but it's not complete pitch dark. There's some light.
So I think I have to agree with that. my own personal judgment on this is that we do have to, as you said, start somewhere. And I trust the things that my consciousness relays to me more when other people also agree. Now, there are schools of thought that place more importance on the individual's internal report, right? And so that those schools of thought are more dismissive of what other people report. And I sort of understand. I sort of understand those things. But I am skeptical that I am always a good reporter. And it is true that for me to accept your report, Doug Hoxworth, or my girlfriend's report, or your wife's report, I have to accept that there are other consciousnesses that are, working to make sense of the world in the same way that I do. But with that as my starting point, that I am simply willing to extend to you the same courtesy of accepting your consciousness that I accept mine, then it seems more reasonable to me to say that what we can report on together is a better report. And by and large, those things are things that we can experiment with directly. And if I make a wild claim that no one else can report to be true, it is more reasonable to be suspect of those reports.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good way. And I think it's worth just to make a plug for science. That's why science is so powerful, because, and the fact that we do it together as a community, because it's important we do have to be somewhat skeptical, but we can't be, you have the spectrum where you have complete and utter skepticism where I can't say anything. And then you have David Bentley Hart, where it's like, I know everything and I just have to say it. And this is how it works. We're somewhere in between, and we all have to kind of hold everything up with a bit of skepticism, but that's why we have each other. That's why it's more powerful done in community, and science is a powerful tool. It maybe can't explain everything, but at least we can all agree as we're doing it, and with peer review and that type of thing, that we can get closer and closer to reality. It's not going the other direction. We're not going the direction where we're having more and more need to stick in God as an explanation. We're actually going the opposite direction, and so I think that's important to recognize, and I think that's an important thing to see that trajectory and to understand that means something, and that says something about ontology, right? It says something about reality that I think goes away from Platonic forms.
I think it does too. The heart of my epistemology is empiricism, and that also means that it is central to my ontology in this case, because the things that I can't reproduce, you probably can't, and the things that you can reproduce, I should be able to. And when those things happen, that is key to my ontology, why I trust my conscious report, and where I stop trusting it. So thank you for joining me for this episode. I am positive that you and I will be doing this again, and in fact, there's an interesting episode this week as a teaser for the listeners. This week's Unbelievable has to do with scientism, and we will be back to address scientism here on Still Unbelievable. And Doug, if you'd like to join me, we can talk about scientism in the next episode.
Yeah, I'm always happy to be on, and I appreciate you having me on this time. It was fun to go through this, and a little bit disconcerting at times, because I wanted to throw in the towel and just say I don't know. But it was really you caught me as this episode came up, and you asked me to do it. I'd been actually reading through in the last year the presocratics. So I'd already been studying it, and then I just read on Plotinus when this episode came out. So I was already kind of in that train, and I'm always, I've always been really interested in ancient thought, so it was a good timing. It's just that it made me realize that this topic is enormous and has a long history, and really Descartes and Kant and all of them, they weren't creating anything new either. They were talking about the same stuff that the pre-Socratics were talking about. So it's a long has a long pedigree as a discussion, and we still haven't figured it out. So and even after today's, we still haven't figured it out either.
Well, I hope that the listeners will have heard this and at least gained a glimpse into some of the background for the January 26th episode of Unbelievable, so that they could penetrate the conversation between the two, between David Bentley Hart and, help me out.
Raymond Tallis.
Thank you. Sorry, Raymond. So I hope that this helped the listeners gain a perspective into that conversation, because it was a little impenetrable at times. And we will be back soon to talk more about scientism, and on this week's episode of Unbelievable. And if you would like to get in touch with us here at Still Unbelievable, right now you can reach out to stillunbelievablepodcast@gmail.com. That's stillunbelievablepodcast@gmail.com. And we thank you for listening to this episode.